What if a plague didn't give you a fever or a cough, but instead it forced you to dance? I mean, literally dance until you died. Well, today we're digging into one of history's absolute weirdest and most terrifying medical mysteries, the dancing plague of 1518.
I know, it sounds like something straight out of a horror movie, but this was real. So the big question is, what kind of strange force could just take over hundreds of people, compelling them to dance without stopping until they literally just drop dead?
So let's set the scene. We're in Strasbourg during a brutally hot summer. And this was not a happy place to be, let me tell you. The city was gripped by a horrible famine, disease was everywhere, and people were living under this constant, heavy cloud of stress and superstitious fear. This bleak backdrop is absolutely key to what's about to happen. Right in the middle of all this death and suffering, a brand new problem started to spread. But it wasn't a fever, it wasn't a pox, it was something so much stranger and honestly, in its own way, just as deadly. And you know, the historical records are actually pretty specific about how it began. In July of 1518, a woman we know as Frau Troffea walked out of her house into the street. She didn't say anything. She just started to dance. And the craziest part? She couldn't stop. Not for hours, not even for days. Now, her frantic solo dance, well, it didn't stay a solo act for long. It set off this terrifying chain reaction. Within just 1 week, more than 30 other people had joined her, all seemingly dancing against their will. And by August, the number had just exploded to around 400 people, all caught up in this bizarre dancing mania. Can you just try to picture that scene for a second? Hundreds of people clogging the streets, just jerking and twisting in this compulsive frenzy. This was no party, folks. We have documents from physicians' notes to city council records that describe pure chaos. Men, women, even children dancing until their feet bled, until they just collapsed from pure exhaustion. As this whole thing spiraled completely out of control, the city authorities were baffled, but they knew they had to do something. Their solution, though, based on what they knew at the time, it would turn out to be a fatal mistake. So, get this. Their big diagnosis was that the dancers had hot blood and that they needed to basically dance the fever out of their systems. And with that logic, they decided the best cure for too much dancing was even more dancing. Seriously. And they didn't just suggest it, they went all in. They cleared out entire guild halls to create dance floors, they built a stage for professional musicians, and they hired them to play music around the clock. They really thought this would help everyone sweat out the sickness. But instead of being a cure, their plan just poured gasoline on the fire. With the music constantly blaring and crowds gathered to watch, the dancers were pushed way beyond their physical limits. Many died right there in the streets from heart attacks, strokes, or just brutal, simple exhaustion. The city's cure had tragically turned into a public spectacle of death. Okay, so with bodies literally piling up and no end in sight, people were desperate for answers. What on earth was going on here? And that's a question that has puzzled historians and scientists for centuries. So, what really caused all this? Over the years, two main theories have really come to the forefront. One is rooted in biology, and the other is rooted in psychology. And it's honestly a lot more unsettling. Okay, so theory number one, ergot poisoning. Ergot is this mold that can grow on damp rye, which was the grain used for pretty much all their bread. And if you eat it, it can cause something called ergotism. We're talking violent muscle spasms, convulsions, even hallucinations. Seems like a pretty good culprit, right? But then you have this other leading theory, mass psychogenic illness, or what used to be called mass hysteria. The idea here is that the plague wasn't a poison at all. It was an illness of the mind itself, where extreme shared stress in a community can actually trigger real physical symptoms across a whole group of people. And this is where it gets really interesting. When you start to weigh the evidence, that poisoning theory really starts to crumble. I mean, yes, ergot causes spasms, but not the kind of coordinated, nonstop dancing that people described for days on end. Plus, the poison actually restricts blood flow, which would make that kind of marathon activity almost impossible. And that's why today, most historians lean heavily towards the mass hysteria explanation. So let's dig into that a little more, because it's a wild concept. Why are most experts so convinced the answer isn't in the city's bread, but inside the minds of its tormented citizens? You just have to remember the world they were living in, that perfect storm of misery we talked about. They were starving, they were sick, they were poor,
And on top of all that, they were living in a deeply superstitious culture, where belief in things like divine curses and demonic possession was absolutely real to them. The level of shared psychological stress was just off the charts.
So here's the crucial point. For a whole community under that much pressure, the mind could basically revolt. People might have slipped into a kind of trance state, and the dancing became a bizarre physical outlet for all that unbearable trauma they couldn't otherwise express. In a way, belief and stress literally turned into biology.
And then, by September, after raging for about 2 months, it just stopped, as suddenly and as mysteriously as it had begun. It left behind a city in total shock, and this profound, disturbing question about the power of the human mind.
The dancers who were left were taken away to a mountain shrine. They went to pray for forgiveness to a saint named Saint Vitus, who they believed they had angered. The city eventually recovered, but the mystery of what force could make people completely lose control of their own bodies, that mystery remained.
This event is just such a powerful and honestly eerie reminder of the deep connection between our minds and our bodies. It shows that under just the right, or maybe wrong, conditions, the most terrifying threat we face might not come from a virus or a poison, but from the depths of our own psychology.
And that's why the dancing plague of 1518 isn't just some weird historical footnote. It's a chilling lesson on the power of the human mind. And it forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. If stress and belief could do this back then, what are they capable of today?